We're just going to wait a couple more minutes until everybody gets in. I didn't want to make sure I leave out anyone who's probably late or maybe late. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I apologize for my voice. I have a weird cold. If you've spoken to me before, my voice is usually not like this, so I'm going to try to talk as slowly and clearly as I possibly can because I want to make sure you guys all understand me. If, for whatever reason, you can't hear me, I'll make sure to speak louder. I'll have Laurel give me a signal. I wanted to thank each and every one of you for joining us today for the workshop for the proposed Industrial General Permit Amendment. This is one of 3 workshops that we're going to be having for the proposed amendments. And I'm just going to go over a few quick things before we get started with the information. So my name is Shuka Rastagarpur. I'm an environmental scientist in the Industrial and Construction Stormwater Unit at the State Water Board. And to my left, you want to do your introductions? Or
My name is Laura Wardrop. I'm the senior over the Industrial and Construction Stormwater Unit. Thank you for coming today. And this is Rich Mull. He's with the Central Valley Regional Board.
And then to my right, we have 2 other staff members. We have Charlo Arzadon and Rebecca Greenwood. And just moving forward, I wanted to give the emergency evacuation information in case if there's an emergency. If an alarm goes off in the building, I want you to note the 2 closest exit doors to you. And those are the doors that you're going to take to exit the building. Please do not take the elevators. Please take the stairs to go downstairs and outside the building. So for document availability, this PowerPoint presentation is going to be available to you online. You do not have to rigorously write down everything that's on the slides. You can go ahead and just listen to the presentation and know that the PowerPoint is going to be available for you online. If you have any questions during the duration of my presentation, I would appreciate it if you wait and hold until after I'm done, just because we have a good, I want to say a good 2 hours of time for you to ask questions. And so I just wanted to go through my presentation first before we get into the questions.
Yeah, and we'll be handing mics out. So we'll have 2 mic runners that'll come in and give you a chance to speak. And then
Yeah, so we are recording this workshop and it's being webcasted live online. So we also have participants listening listening and watching to this workshop, and they're going to be asking questions as well. So I think for the purposes of answering questions, if we do start getting questions over our email, which, by the way, for those listening, the email is at the bottom of my slide. If you want to submit questions, we'll alternate between speakers or commenters here and people who want to ask questions over the email. And so we have mics at the ready. Since this is being recorded, we need to make sure that everything that you say is that we can hear over the video. And so I want to make sure that you put your mouth as closely, but do not touch the mic. So we just want to make sure that your comments are recorded. I don't know if there's anything else I need to say up front, but
Maybe. Hello? We
Yeah,
will be
get really
breaking for lunch.
oh, yeah.
So we'll probably be hopefully around 11:30, but we'll announce that so you don't have to rush out. We will let you eat lunch.
Yeah, so we'll have about an hour's worth of break, probably around 11:30, just to make sure that we're not going to get hangry near the end of the presentation. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. So the proposed industrial general permit, I'm just going to preface to say I'm just going to call it the general permit from now on, but the proposed amendments has three main major components. The first is the sufficiently sensitive test methods. The second is the total maximum daily load implementation requirements. And the third is the compliance options. And I did also want to preface that throughout this presentation, I'm going to be providing a general overview of the proposed amendment. I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but I will answer questions if necessary, if you want more details about the components. But just throughout the presentation, I'm just going to give you a big overlaying overview of what the proposed amendments are. The sufficiently sensitive test methods is the first component of the amendment, and this is per a federal regulation from US EPA for requiring that all national pollutant discharge elimination system permits are required to incorporate or are required to have all samples be tested with sufficiently sensitive analytical test methods. And so that means that the minimum level of the method is going to have to be at or below the criteria or the permit limitation. So the test method that you end up using has to meet the numeric action levels in the permit and the proposed TMDL numeric action levels and the numeric effluent limitations. And the reason why we're incorporating this implementation language is because it's a US EPA approved federal regulation.
So most dischargers in the industrial permit are already using sufficiently sensitive methods, and this was put into the Federal Register in 2014, right after we adopted the permit. So this is just making it clear that we're implementing 40 CFR 136, and that we're looking at dischargers using appropriate methods for their stormwater samples. It shouldn't be a huge impact to the regulated community because most people are already doing this.
I think your voice has to be a little bit closer to the mic, but that was still, I think, was she heard? Were you guys able to hear her? Okay. I just wanted to make sure. And the second major component is the total maximum daily load implementation language. So as a background, a total maximum daily load, a TMDL, is the total maximum amount of a pollutant that a water body can receive and still attain water quality standards. TMDLs address a 303D listed water body, and a TMDL is amended into a basin plan. And so it's a planning document. It is not self-implemented. And so when a TMDL is adopted by the Regional Water Board and amended into the Basin Plan, it's required that NPDES permits implement the requirements of the TMDL. So Discharges with an NPDES permit, such as the industrial general permit, have to comply with the effluent limitations that are consistent with the assumptions and requirements of any available waste load allocations for discharges prepared by the state and approved by US EPA. So any waste load allocations that are adopted into a TMDL must be translated and implemented into an NPDES permit. And the second reason why we need to comply with TMDL requirements is because any waste discharge requirement, such as the basin plans, need to be implemented through, any waste discharge requirements, such like our industrial general permit, need to implement any water quality control plans, like the basin plan. So our permit is required to implement basin plan requirements, meaning the TMDL requirements, and required to implement any any waste load allocations that are appointed to our dischargers. The reissued industrial general permit was adopted by the board in 2014. We, at the time, incorporated two elements for TMDLs. The first is we have attachment E, which has the list of TMDLs that were approved and adopted by the regional boards or adopted by US EPA. And the list that you find in attachment E is about 36 or 37 TMDLs, which have been adopted in 4 regional boards. We have the San Francisco Bay region, Los Angeles, Santa Ana, and San Diego region. So we have 36 TMDLs that were adopted. The map to the right shows how many TMDLs there are in each region. So there's 3 adopted TMDLs that we're addressing in the San Francisco Bay region. There's 25 in the LA region. There's 1 in the Santa Ana region and 7 in the San Diego region. So these are all adopted and approved TMDLs by the Regional Water Board and by US EPA. And at the time when we generated that list, it was so that we already have something to look at for the amendment, like right now, to look at for implementation and drafting requirements. And so we have that list set out already for us. And the second the second component of the reissued permit also had the requirement for the regional water boards to develop and propose TMDL-specific permit requirements for the TMDLs that were adopted in their region. And so the responsibility first came to the regional water boards to look at the TMDLs that they had in their region that we were looking at from the lists shown here. So the LA Regional Board had 25 adopted TMDLs that we needed to address in our permit. And so the hand was first given to them to draft TMDL specific permit requirements and propose them as draft for public commenting. And so they conducted a 30-day public comment period. I believe it was in March of 2016. And the whole purpose was to have the regional boards implement their adopted TMDLs and to get initial feedback from stakeholders. The regional water boards are not responsible to adopt TMDL permit-specific requirements. And so the 30-day public comment period was to get initial feedback for the initial translations of the TMDLs for this permit. Subsequently, after we had the 30-day public comment period at the regional boards, we sent out invitations to stakeholders who had submitted public comments to the regional board, TMDL specific language for focused stakeholder outreach sessions in winter of 2016-2017. So we had focused meetings with the participants, with the individuals who had submitted comments to the regional boards, so that we can go over the comments that they had submitted and what we and how we took their comments and how we started developing our versions, the state board translations of the TMDL specific requirements. And so During that process, we had several meetings to make sure that we understood the comments correctly from the stakeholder commentees, and that the proposed draft language that we were at the time writing out made sense, and that we got kind of initial feedback from them. And during that time is when we had the compliance alternative options developed, which I will explain later on in one of my slides, but that is also where the initial talkings of the compliance options came about. So after we had the focused stakeholder outreach sessions, that was back in winter of 2016, 2017, up until this point, we had been drafting the proposed TMDL specific language for the industrial general permit, and the resources that we used for interpreting this language is of course the adopted Regional Water Board and USCPA TMDLs. We had to read the TMDLs, the accommodating staff report, the resolutions, and we also took the Regional Water Board specific translated language that they had proposed in March of 2016, and we also took in the comments that were submitted to the Regional Water Boards as basis for writing out our draft proposed language. We also had received guidance from the State Water Board Council and Executive Management, and we had to make sure that the requirements met the assumptions of the TMDL and to assess whether the general permit already addresses the TMDL requirements. So that's a very important thing to note, is to make sure that we were not repeating language that already exists in the general permit if we wanted to appropriately address the TMDL. We just didn't want to write duplicative language if it already existed in the permit. With respect to the timeline, the public notice for this workshop and the subsequent workshops, the public hearing and the public commenting period was released on November 21st, a couple weeks ago. The public comment period started on December 15th. So this past Friday, the technical documents, the proposed TMDL or the proposed industrial general permit amendment technical documents were posted on our webpage on Friday, and so the comment period started. We have a 45-day public comment period that will end on January 31st. And the public hearing will be held on January 9th. So it's a little within during the public commenting period. So it's a chance for you to have an opportunity to read the proposed amendments and to come forth at the public hearing. And you can verbally say your comments, what you have at the time, to the board and to the staff and to me. And you would then go ahead and submit your official written, not that the board hearing isn't official, I'm sorry, then you would be able to submit your written comments to the proposed amendment, and those are due to the clerk to the board by January 31st. All this information is in the public notice on how to submit the public comments, and all the information is in the public notice for the hearing as well. And so if you have not seen the hearing and heard about this workshop through word of mouth, I suggest you see me or one of the members of the staff so I can refer you to the public notice so that you have all that information. The documents that we are amending for the proposed general permit is the order, the attachment E, the fact sheet, which is the supportive language for why we're coming up with the proposed language in the order, and the attachment E, and other provisions as necessary for incorporating the TMDL specific requirements.
And maybe I'll try to get this right.
Yeah.
So the attachment I is where the compliance options, that language is, and that's, for example, one of the additional attachments that we've added because of this amendment.
So these items are being amended specifically for the TMDL specific requirements. When I get to the compliance options, I'll make sure to reemphasize that in addition to the order and the fact sheet, attachment I is a new attachment specific for language for the compliance options. So these documents are only for the TMDL specific requirements. This is just a quick diagram to show the process, or just kind of the thought process that we take when we're reading the TMDLs. All the TMDLs are written differently by different staff persons, by different regions, and so we had to kind of take a very uniform approach to reading the TMDLs and making sure that we're consistently translating the requirements and writing consistent translation language in the proposed industrial general permit. And basically at the end of the day, we want to see, does the existing general permit language mean TMDL compliance? Meaning, do we need to write additional proposed implementation language for each TMDL in order to make sure that we're successfully implementing the TMDL, or does the existing general permit language already satisfy the TMDL's requirements? Again, we don't want to write duplicative implementation language. We want to make sure to see if the current general permit already satisfies the requirements of the TMDL. And if not, that's where we kind of go into writing more detailed implementation language to appropriately translate the parts of the TMDL that's not already addressed by our general permit. So in general, the proposed TMDL waste load allocations were translated into 3 different categories. So the first category, if there was no waste load allocation appointed to our dischargers, but for some reason or another, our dischargers are highlighted in the TMDL or whatnot, this is just one example, one very brief example that we would have the TMDL requirements say that the general permit's requirements satisfy the requirements of the TMDL. And so we would just tell the dischargers that for this TMDL, you just need to comply with the permit as is. The second translation for waste load allocation is TMDL specific numeric action levels. So TNALs is how we're calling them. And we're calling them TNALs because they act just like how NALs act in the general permit. They're a numeric action level. We're just differentiating them between a NAL in Table 2 of the general permit and a TMDL NAL. The numbers will also most likely be different, and so it's just the term to differentiate between the two. And the third translation is TMDL specific numeric effluent limitations. And so some of the waste load allocations were translated into numeric effluent limitations. I would like to note that the dischargers have to comply with the general permit's numeric action levels in addition to the TMDL specific requirements. So you're required to comply with the numeric action levels as how you have been complying with so far. And additionally, you're going to be complying with the proposed TMDL numeric action levels or your numeric effluent limitations. The monitoring reporting requirements are going to be modeled after the current general permit unless specifically said otherwise. The pollutant identification is also modeled after the general permit. And so for circumstances for this general permit, you are not required to comply with the TMDL requirements if you are identified to be in the watershed and discharging into that water body. You still have to conduct your pollutant source assessment and see if you are discharging, or the discharger has to see if they would potentially be discharging that pollutant in their stormwater discharge or not, or authorized non-stormwater discharge, to say that you would have to then sample for it. So you're not required to sample for the pollutants unless you have identified it in your pollutant source assessment. And I just wanted to give examples of the circumstance of how I translated those 3 categories for the waste load allocation. So the first category, when we say compliance with the general permit, is compliance with the TMDL requirements. In that example, I would have read through a TMDL and saw that the TMDL did not assign a waste load allocation to industrial sources. And so for us, I would say, okay, if the TMDL in the San Diego Bay somehow identified industrial as a source, but did not identify or did not assign a waste load allocation to industrial sources, then there is no further implementation requirements necessary. And so for those dischargers, I would say you would just simply need to comply with the permit as is. The second instance when compliance with the TMDL requirements is through TMDL numeric action levels, TNALs. There's multiple examples as to how we came to a translation for a TNAL, but just for the basics, the first example is that the compliance deadline is beyond the general permit's term. So the general permit is an NPDES permit. It's a 5-year issue term. Each TMDL would assumingly have compliance deadlines for when to comply with the waste load allocations or other requirements of the TMDL for our dischargers. So if they have a compliance deadline that is past our 5-year term, so past 2020, 2020, is it 2020? The reissued permit? Yeah, so if the compliance deadline is past 2020, for this case, that waste load allocation would be translated as a TNAL, a TMDL numeric action level for this cycle of the permit. And then for future cycles of the permit, once the TMDL compliance deadline comes within the permit cycle, that's when we'll reevaluate it and see if we need to translate it otherwise. The second instance when a TNAL is translated from a waste load allocation is when a concentration-based waste load allocation or a concentration-based numeric target with the point of compliance is located at the receiving water body and not at the point of discharge. And if you understand the sampling requirements of the general permit, you would know that the sampling requirements are required at the point of discharge. And so if a TMDL assigns a waste load allocation at the receiving water body, we have identified and explained in the fact sheet that it's infeasible to require the dischargers to meet that at the receiving water body when it's outside the boundaries of their discharge point, and that it doesn't make sense. And so for this case, we're assigning that waste load allocation at their discharge point instead, and saying that because we're not translating the TMDL language exactly as how it says, that we're going to have this as a TMDL numeric action level and would not be translated as an effluent limitation. The third instance where a waste load allocation would be translated to a TMDL numeric action level is when a mass-based waste load allocation is assigned. And we've determined through descriptions that we've written out in the fact sheet that we would be able to translate and be able to successfully implement into our structure of our general permit. And so we decided to appoint the concentration-based numeric target to the industrial facilities instead of the mass-based targets. And so when again, because we are following, because we're applying requirements that's not exactly as written as the TMDL says, is the reason why we are translating the waste load allocation as a TMDL numeric action level. So the third translation for the waste load allocations is numeric effluent limitations, and the instances where we would translate a waste load allocation into a numeric effluent limitation is when a concentration-based waste load allocation is specifically assigned to industrial dischargers at the point of discharge. And this, I'm not going to go through this, but this table basically provides an overview of the different pollutant categories and the number of TMDLs that are have been developed for that pollutant category and what the proposed compliance measure is. So some of them, it's a mixture of different compliance points depending on how the TMDL is written. And so sometimes it's going to be comply with permit, it's going to be comply with the proposed TNALs or comply with the proposed NELs. And again, yeah.
On this slide, part of this was to help kind of see where the meat and potatoes is of the amendment. So if you look at the trash or the salts or the sediment, you can see that the approach is more comply with the current permit. So when you're reviewing the amendment, it's a long amendment. Those are the less contentious or the less impacts on dischargers because they can just comply with their current permit. So you can see that the metals and the nutrients and the toxics as well as the bacteria ones are the ones that, you know, I think we're going to get more feedback on as we go through the amendment.
And for those of you who walked in after I started the presentation, the PowerPoint will be posted on the webpage. So all this will be available to you, hopefully by the end of today, online on the webpage. So the requirements for everything that we are proposing in the proposed industrial general permit is going to be implemented through the stormwater multiple application and report tracking system, SMARTS. So everything is going to still be implemented via SMARTS. The item that's going to be a little different for implementation via SMARTS is that SMARTS will not be you will be required to self-identify and self-calculate and and report compliance on your own. And so SMARTS is not going to tell you when you have reached level 1 for your TNOWs or when you've reached level 2 for your TNOWs. That's something that you're going to have to still submit your information into SMARTS and be able to self-comply and self-report.
So an example of how this would work is SMARTS is going to continue to implement the numeric action level calculations. And so those will continue on through this amendment. And we're proposing that because there are so many TMDL specific targets and effluent limits that it's too much for SMARTS to do at this time. And it is a general permit, so a discharger is always ultimately responsible for their compliance. And so if you have a monitoring report where you'd be entering your sampling, the regional boards and the public would have your sampling data and the permit for compliance evaluations. And so this will be a little different than, like Shuka said, a little different than the exceedance response action, numeric action levels in the permit.
And when we realized that when we're working through SMARTS and knowing that there's TMDL specific requirements for different watersheds, we started developing maps of the custom watersheds that were identified in the TMDL. And so we were unsure, I'll talk about this in the next slide, but we were unsure whether this will be incorporated into SMARTS or would be a feature that's outside of SMARTS. But either way, we will be having these watershed maps and layers that's going to be available to the public. And this is something for the dischargers, for the stakeholders, and for us as well. And so we basically used the Latin long that is inserted into SMARTS for your facility to identify which watershed that facility is located in, so that the discharger has a better understanding of what watershed they're in and hopefully what receiving water body they are discharging into and what requirements they will have to comply with. And from our perspective, or from our standpoint, this is obviously for implementation and for enforcement purposes for the Regional Water Board. It's just to gain a better understanding of where the facility is located in and to know what requirements apply to that facility.
Yeah, one of the challenges with having maps plugged into SMARTS automatically is that the maps are models. They're geographic boundaries that are they're a draft watershed that was used in the development of the TMDL, or something that we came up with that's very similar. Like if the TMDL didn't have a picture of where the watershed boundary is, we had to create that. And so they are models. And one thing that the watersheds, one of the issues with implementation of TMDLs in SMARTS would be, say you're right outside of the really big Santa Clara watershed, but you have a municipal pipe that goes right into that watershed. That TMDL would still apply to you, but SMARTS wouldn't pick that up because it's only as smart as the layers that we can put in, no pun intended. So those are some things that we don't want to lead people down the wrong line because of a model that we've put in the SMARTS. So we're evaluating all of those strategies to come up with what would be most appropriate for dischargers. But we will have these, like Shuka said, available before or around adoption.
And the same approach applies if you are identified within a watershed but for one reason or another you're discharging to a bordering watershed, or if you're not discharging into any water body at all and you're capturing your stormwater, that's something that we would be kind of incorporating into smarts to help you be able to report and identify that if necessary. And that's going to be helpful for the regional water board staff as well to know what you're actually complying with. So the third component of the proposed general permit amendment are the compliance options. And as I said earlier, this idea came forth during the focus stakeholder outreach sessions that we had with stakeholders who commented to the regional water board proposed language. And the compliance options are in attachment I of the general permit. And so in addition to the order and the fact sheet, attachment I and attachment E for the TMDL specific requirements, attachment I is a new attachment that we have for the proposed requirements for the compliance options. The two proposed compliance options is on-site compliance and off-site compliance. On-site compliance means the capture and use and infiltration of the 85th percentile 24-hour storm event. The off-site compliance option is participation agreement with a municipality, and so meaning that you would be going into an agreement with a local municipality and they would be taking in your stormwater or authorized non-stormwater discharge runoff and taking that in and treating that through a local BMP. Initially, these compliance options were only going to be available for the dischargers complying with the TMDL requirements, but the compliance options are going to be available for dischargers statewide. So this is a statewide proposed requirement. And if you opt to comply with one of these compliance options, you would basically be deemed in compliance with the TMDL specific requirements and the general permit requirements. I say that very broadly. You will have to go through the proposed amendment and read through the fact sheet and know specifically what components of the permit you're going to be in compliance with. But basically, this is kind of a catch-all for you to comply with on-site or off-site capture and use of your industrial water, so that it's basically a mass loading reduction into the receiving water body that we have listed for impairment. So basically, on-site and off-site compliance is an option for everyone statewide. For on-site compliance, in general, the BMP is going to have to be designed and installed and approved by a California licensed professional engineer. Only stormwater and authorized non-stormwater dischargers are allowed to enter the BMP. Operation and maintenance plans are required, and the reporting of all BMP bypass and overflows are required. However, they're not going to be used for purposes of enforcement. They're just going to be used for data to see how efficient the BMP is meeting the modeled assumptions of compliance. And so it's only going to be used for data purposes. We're not going to be using the bypass and overflow samples as purposes for enforcement. The influent going into the BMP will need to meet the maximum contaminant levels for drinking water standards. And so if those are not able to be met, you are required to install groundwater monitoring requirements or monitoring equipment, such as lysimeters. All the primary and secondary maximum contaminant levels are required to be met. And the influent to dry wells are must meet the MCLs, and they're not eligible for groundwater monitoring equipment options.
So I just wanted to highlight something in this slide is that this is for infiltration BMPs. This capture and use option can be other types of capture and use BMPs. For example, you have a diversion to a sanitary sewer, and they're going to take your water, you have it in tanks, you're going to meter it out, and you don't discharge that volume of water from that up to and including that 24-hour event specified in the amendment. So, but when it comes to infiltration, there are a lot of concerns that we'll have to work through this proposed amendment on the quality of drinking water supply in groundwater. The Central Valley has a lot of issues with salts. There's contaminated plumes. And so this is our proposal to alleviate that concern up front through minimum treatment measures for infiltration BMPs. So just know that you can have other BMPs going on, but this is for infiltration.
The second compliance option is offsite compliance with an agreement between the industrial facility and the local municipality. We have kind of broadly written out requirements for how you can comply with this option, but in essence, this is an agreement between the discharger and the local municipality, and the approval must be made by the local regional water board. What is important and key to note is that the watershed-based BMP is required to be in the same watershed as the facility and the TMDL. And so if the municipality covers more than one watershed, the BMP, that's the offsite BMP that is structured, must be still within the facility and the TMDL if you want to be able to partner up with that requirement. And so if you're a facility and you want to work with a municipality, you have to make sure that the offsite BMP is still within your residing watershed. So for next steps, we have 2 more of the same workshop in Los Angeles and San Diego this upcoming Thursday and Friday. You're more than welcome to join that as well. We'll be going over the same thing. It's going to be the same workshop. The public commenting period has commenced this past Friday, and so the technical documents are available on our website. If you need help finding it, you're more than welcome to come and ask me. The public hearing is scheduled for January 9th. It's a board public hearing. There's no adoption or decision being made at this public hearing. This is just set for introducing the proposed general amendment to the board and to allow stakeholders to come up forth and be able to say their comments and their questions on the proposed industrial general permit to the board and to the staff as well. Again, the public comment period ends on January 31st. If you need information on how to submit it, it's all written down in the public notice. And as for what happens after this, beyond the public hearing and the public commenting period, we're going to be taking in your public comments and we're going to be responding to them and addressing them in the draft proposed amendment. And we're just going to do this cycle as many times until we feel like we have an appropriate draft amendment to take to the board for adoption. And so we do not have a date for adoption, but we're hoping and we're aiming for late 2018. So at this time, this is my contact information. I also have cards if you need them. But at this time, we are opening this up for questions and comments on the draft amendment. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we'll have Charlo give the mic to you. Please make sure that you speak directly into the mic because this is being recorded and there are people watching live over the webcast and we need to make sure that you are heard. And so you can go ahead and open up for any comments. Go ahead.
Our ERA reports for our level 1 and level 2 are due by January 1st.
Yes.
Are we going to be able to, because this will still be going through the comment period, so are we going to be able to use the infiltration compliance option for those ERA reports?
So you can go ahead.
So there was a letter that went out to all the level 2 labeled facilities in the permit currently. And it said basically, consider planning for some type of on-site best management practice that would capture up to and including the 85th percentile 24-hour daily storm volume. the level 2 action plan that's due January 1st is something where you could have that plan in there, but a word of caution would be plan for it, but this is a draft proposal. I'm hoping that these options stay in there. We've spent a lot of time with stakeholders on having something like this, and so I would say plan for it, but be part of the process, be engaged in how the amendment's going before you invest all your money into the option. So it's kind of we want people to plan for it, and we're allowing that planning process to happen, especially for level 2 facilities.
Regarding the offsite compliance with the MS4, I'm sorry, I brought in the MS4 because the MS4 is where we have our EWIMPs.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you kind of alluding to that we could then pair up with the city with their EWIMP in order to do offsite compliance?
I believe that's the way that it's proposed.
So there's the way that the municipal stormwater alternative permits work is that they can use best management practices through their reasonable assurance models and come up with BMPs that would meet, that it will eventually attain receiving water limits. We don't have the exact same authorities in the industrial permit to go exactly through the municipal stormwater process. So we have to have BMPs that are 85th percentile type retention BMPs through those agreements with the cities. I know that there's just a little bit of a different regulation for industrial stormwater versus municipal stormwater. But what we envision is that there will be projects that the municipalities and the industrial facilities want to work together on for joint compliance with their stormwater permitting requirements. But it may not every single time be through their plans. It may be a separate agreement. Thank you. You're welcome.
There's one down here, Charlo.
It's a brave new world. Thank you, Charlo.
Along that same line, I was wondering if you know of any current plans for any municipalities in California to reach out to the industrial facilities to kind of integrate this whole process, because for one discharger to do it alone doesn't make any sense when there's a lot more that are probably having the same TMDL issue.
I absolutely agree that in some cases, this may be a slow ball. I don't think that we're going to have all of the answers up front where everybody's going to be able to jump on this right now. But the point of us putting in there was to make sure that dischargers were not excluded through any of those agreements that could happen. Because we knew that if we didn't put it in the permit, industrial facilities were kind of cut out of the equation of other ways to comply through the permit. But what I could see is maybe one very large discharger that has land that, they might do an agreement that way for compliance. But for cities to come up with a fee structure and actually have a program for the mom and pops, it will take time to have multiple smaller dischargers coming into some type of agreement like this. Another thing that's happening in Los Angeles is the LA Department of Water and Power is very interested in buying some of this captured water. So we might see some incentives there as well. I don't work there, but I've heard about it. It's an interesting proposal they have. So it's going to take time. I think that we're just opening the door a little bit for people to explore this option.
On page 14 of your presentation, could you give an example of how you can have the IGP NELs comply with those and the TMDL specific requirements? Are you talking about you would have different parameters, and so you'd have to consider?
Yeah. So the point of that bullet was to say that the numeric action levels in Table 2, you're still complying with those parameters in addition to your TMDL specific requirements. That may be a mixture of TMDL NALs or numeric effluent limitations for the same parameter, but it'll be a different number. And so you're going to have to kind of work with, which number. Obviously, you would have to aim for the lower number in order to make sure that you comply with both. And so in addition to that, the exceedance requirements are different. So for numeric action levels, for all of them except for, oil, grease, the first three, I think there's and TSS, there's annual exceedance types and there's instantaneous maximum exceedance types. And so for all the TMDL specific proposed parameters, they're all in line with the numeric action levels in Table 2 that have an annual average exceedance requirement. So you can either do, you would be required to do an average of 4 QSEs to be able to see whether or not you would exceed or not with the parameter number to know that you would be going into level 1 or level 2. But for the TMDL proposed requirements for both the TMDL numeric action, just for the TMDL numeric action levels, the exceedance type would be an instantaneous maximum exceedance type, not an annual average exceedance type. So in addition to having two different numbers for copper, for example, you would be required to comply with the copper NAL annual average exceedance type. In addition, if you're in the watershed and you're a facility discharging copper through your stormwater, you would have to comply with the copper TNAL, which is a different number and also a different exceedance type. It would be an instantaneous maximum exceedance. A little tricky, but you would have to see what's the better number to aim for so that you make sure that you comply with the TNAL and also the NAL.
And we have a question from online. Juga.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Do you want to go ahead and read it?
You want to go first? Okay. So this one's from Heather. There are about 3 questions, and I'll try to summarize, but they're about the compliance options. The first is, what are the legal obligations between the municipalities and the industrial facilities? And are there financial elements allowed between the cities and the private industrial facilities? And by that, she has clarified that she means, will the city be able to charge a fee for the private industrial facility to use their compliance option? Oh, and the final one is, if there are violations at the industrial site and they have an agreement with the city, is their compliance liability with the city or the industrial facility?
Those are really good questions. We've talked about these answers for a while, just how this would roll out. So the legal obligations, okay, let me back up. All we are doing in this amendment is opening the door so people can start these agreements. Because it's so new, we didn't want to specify exactly what the cities and these industrial facilities, what kind of agreements they can enter, what they can or can't do. Maybe that's something that comes in 2020 when we have more information. So these agreements are fairly open-ended as long as they result in a retention type of 85th percentile BMP as what the agreement is about. So there are legal obligations that would be specified in those municipal agreements. So what the industrial facility is still required to do, one thing that isn't going to change is that they still keep their industrial permit. So maybe that becomes a pretreatment type of program. And then they have obligations through the agreement with the municipalities. There is financial elements. It could be that the city changes their fee structure. That's something that comes up in the stormwater planning all the time, is barriers to funding for stormwater as a resource. And then violations. This is one of the things that we'll see how many municipalities even want to enter into these agreements, and it may be limited at first, because if it's a discharge from their municipal stormwater system, there are obligations and liabilities on that discharge. So those will have to be worked out through the agreement, but those are also, in their permits of what they're liable for. So it'll be interesting to see some of these first agreements come out, and it will get more clear over time.
Okay, I was reading your compliance options.
Oh, I think your mic turns off.
Okay, thank you. So page 2 of your compliance option, letter B, and I was looking at the language where it states that they could redirect their runoff volume to a publicly owned sanitary sewer treatment facility. And since this language is going to be in an industrial general permit with industries generally, they may take this as permission to discharge. And what I was hoping that you guys would consider is to incorporate some language that is similar to what you did on page 9, where it states the discharger may enter into a local agreement with the publicly owned treatment works, because sometimes the additional rainwater would cause issues in a rain event.
Thank you for that comment. Yeah, we meant it to include any of the requirements from the sanitary sewer owner, that they have an agreement, they have a permit to have that water go there, and we can make that clear. Please consider entering that as a public comment, but I am taking a note. Thank you.
We have another question from online. This one comes from Timothy Simpson. It says, please describe the schedule requirements for a facility that is in level 2 now for a TMDL pollutant that has a lower TMDL NAL. The second is, please explain the time schedule order and how that works. And the third is, are dischargers that exceed NELs subject to mandatory minimum penalties? If so, do they apply for all rain events or just for those that are monitored?
That is a question. So, right, I mean, obviously this is a proposed amendment, so any provisions in here don't exist until the board adopts. It's proposed. We could put it in red everywhere. Proposed. So there are no TMDL required actions on a discharger at this time. They still have to comply, with the basin plans. There's all these discharge prohibitions in the permit to not cause or contribute to exceedances, and there's discharge prohibitions on exceeding or being a nuisance. So those all apply, but we don't have any specific language in there about the TMDLs until the board adopts.
And I'll add that concerning for what the compliance deadline is for each TMDL, it's going to be translated differently. So there might be several TMDLs that have waste load allocations that were translated into TNALs that have a compliance deadline that has already passed. And so we know that once the proposed amendment is adopted by the board, at the time the proposed language says that they would be required to immediately reflect on the new TNAL numbers as compliance. They're not going to have time to comply with the TNAL numbers.
Yes, and there's always, when the board adopts, there's a difference between an adoption and the effective date. And so there's always negotiation pieces with the board. People request that there's a time in between. The board can consider it. Staff may request it because we need to implement or upgrade certain things in the electronic system. So there will be an adoption date and an effective date. And once it's effective, what Shuka is saying is that some of these with past compliance dates, these TMDLs, that they may be effective immediately. So if it's a numeric effluent limit and it's effective immediately upon the effective date, the next stormwater samples you take will be compared to these numeric effluent limits. If it's a TMDL action level, the next time you take your qualifying storm event samples, those will be compared to action levels for the TMDLs, and you'll go through the exceedance response action process. But they apply very quickly once the effective date rolls around. Did you want to say anything else before I answer okay. So for now, if you're in level 2, I would be looking at attachment E. I'd be finding my receiving waters and see if there's any TMDL proposed language, and I would be working through that language and trying to understand it. The second thing is time schedule orders. The state water board, or my unit, we're not the time schedule order keepers. Those are the regional water boards. And so if you want a compliance extension, you'll have to work through your regional water board. I am not the expert on those time schedule orders, but I know that they can be individual, and that's more common, and potentially groups depending on the situation. When it comes to the numeric effluent limits, yes, mandatory minimum penalties can apply. If you look at our enforcement policy, there's a bunch of calculations on how you accrue a numeric effluent limit MMP, and so we'll be getting more familiar with that if this amendment goes, if it actually gets adopted. But yes, MMPs can apply to numeric effluent limits for stormwater.
For numeric effluent limitations, the proposed language says that the water quality-based corrective actions apply. And so there's a specific section, I don't know that's off the top of my head, but that section exists in the permit for that situation. So that's another thing to reflect on for NEL exceedances.
And the water quality-based corrective actions were in the 2014 adopted permit. I think they're under the special conditions.
And the second part of that question was if the MMPs apply to all rain events or those that are just monitored.
Well, I think that I'm not an enforcement expert, so I don't think I can answer that in a hypothetical setting. It would depend on what data is part of the enforcement case. I mean, if the regions take their own samples, there's lots of events that could be part of that calculation.
Hello? Yes, so currently it's not a violation of the permit to exceed an NAL, but I did see some language that said something about an NEL exceedance is a violation of the permit. Does that also apply to the TNALs, or is it just the NELs, and how is that going to work out?
An effluent limitation is different than the action levels that we have in the permit. And so a TNAL is going to act exactly like how an NAL acts in the permit. So if you, like I explained earlier, all the TNALs are going to have an instantaneous maximum exceedance type that's defined in the permit. And so if you exceed the instantaneous maximum requirement for a specific parameter, you're going to go to level 1 for that pollutant. So it's going to follow the same exceedance response actions as the NALs.
The TMDL numeric action levels, there's a lot of acronyms, I know, and the numeric action levels are not violations of the permit. It's a violation not to complete your exceedance response action requirements. And what Shuka is saying is the numeric effluent limits are different. Those are violations. They're immediate violations once you trigger the NEL, if you're over the NEL as specified in the permit, once those are adopted.
And will that be based off of instantaneous, or is there like a calculation that they can follow based off the NEL, and will it be one exceedance?
It's two exceedances.
So two instantaneous off the NEL
in
as
the
well.
permit right now, there's a definition for instantaneous maximum and annual average. It's the same definition. So you would be applying the instantaneous maximum definition. So it's two exceedances would mean that you're in violation of the NEL for that parameter.
And part of the reason that we did numeric effluent limits and the TMDL action levels as instantaneous type of exceedances is because stormwater is not a chronic discharge like a wastewater treatment plant. It comes in episodic conditions, so it's more aligned to an acute situation in the receiving water, not a chronic one. And so we translated these on more the acute definitions already laid out in the permit, where we look at the facility averages as more of a chronic type of situation. So that's why they're all going towards the instantaneous type of language.
Okay, we have another question from online. This one's from Charles. The TMDL amendment includes dry weight TMDLs, for example, page 37, attachment E, that require the dischargers to collect QSE samples. What will be the process to translate stormwater samples into dry weight results? And the second question is, are dischargers only required to comply with TMDL monitoring requirements if the TMDL parameter is an industrial pollutant at the facility? For example, if a facility does not have activities that make an indicator bacteria as an industrial pollutant, would the facility be required to perform bacteria monitoring if it discharges indirectly into a water body with a bacteria TMDL?
So for the last question, you will still conduct your pollutant source assessment for stormwater industrial stormwater related discharges. And so just like how you're conducting your pollutant source assessment as is, that's what you're going to be sampling for. If you have bacteria TMDL requirements in your watershed that you would in respect be responsible for, if you have not identified that you are discharging bacteria for the types of equipment and material that you have on your site, then you're not required to sample for bacteria. Then we can backtrack to the other question. What was it again?
The first question is about the dry weight TMDLs. What would the process be to translate stormwater samples into dry weight results?
So the dry weight sampling requirements is a new concept into our requirements. And so you'll see that there's going to be several pollutants that are required to be measured as dry weight and not a stormwater flow sample or a water column sample. And so I think did we put in a recommendation for sampling for the dry weights? Okay, so I think we have a EPA approved method for how we would be sampling for the dry weight samples. If it's not in there, we can correct that. But otherwise, if it's not clear as to how to follow those sampling measures, I would recommend submitting that as a formal comment, and that's something that I'll look into. But dry weight sampling is different than the stormwater flow effluent sampling that we have in our permit currently.
Yeah, essentially it comes down to that pollutant source assessment, making sure that you have the parameter if you're discharging it or not, and then it would be a sampling method that's similar to collecting TSS and then having your sediments tested.
Are there any questions? Go ahead.
I have to ask this. So December 15th, all the draft order and various components of it were issued. Major holiday time period, ERA reports are being developed. I'm here on behalf of the California Stormwater Quality Association, and one of the concerns with some of the folks that I'm talking with, we're trying to provide very constructive sets of comments, is the time frame. It's just incredibly difficult given this major holiday week that we have to really prepare and provide constructive comments on January 9th, and then also kind of pull together something that is really valid for the end of January. Of course, we always strive to do that, but I was asked to see if we might be able to have any flexibility in that time frame so that we can make sure that we comprehensively review all of the new language, understand all the connections. As you can appreciate, the NALs, the TNALs, the TNELs, how those relate back and forth with the receiving water limitations, discharge prohibitions, effluent limits, et cetera, TMDLs that are past dates or not. So there's just a lot of complex relationships built into the permit language. So I just want to know if, I know that that's sometimes a difficult request to be able to respond to right away, but I think on behalf of CASCA, we'd like to know if there's any possibility to move the timeframes.
So I will say what we did do a 45-day to help, because we usually do 30 days for these amendments, even reissuances. And so we did extend it. And if that is not, I understand what you're saying. Where I've seen extension requests come in is way above my level, is they go to somebody like Karen Larson, who's the Division of Water Quality Director, or even to someone above me. And here comes our counsel.
So staff cannot extend the comment period, but if you want to direct a request to extend the comment period, please do so to the board clerk and she'll direct it to the appropriate people.
Right. No, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm just putting it out for the sake of our conversation today.
And
I don't have a temperature on it.
I would encourage you to do so as soon as possible.
Yes, understood.
And before releasing the documents and doing this process, knowing that we would be releasing at this time, we knew how sensitive it was going to be. It was just the direction that we had to go ahead and move forward and release the documents. And we don't pause during the holiday season or during vacation season, unfortunately, but this is just how things played out. And this is when we were able to get our documents out. And so, you know, with enough concern, and if it gets elevated, then yes, things with this time pressure could be relaxed for you to have enough time to review the documents. And I will reevaluate that the board hearing is just an informational hearing. There's no adoption being, there's no adoptions happening. So
yeah, so basically if we get word down that there's an extension, we'll accommodate, we'll take that direction from our management.
Especially if in the hypothetical sense where it ends up not being flexible and we still have the board hearing, I mean, we're going to have the board hearing date on the 9th, but if the public comment period stays at January 31st and we get enough feedback that it was not enough time to evaluate, like I mentioned in my last slide, we'll do this cycle as many times as we need to make sure that all the stakeholders have enough time to read the documents. So we would potentially do another 30-day or 45-day public comment period for you to relook at the technical documents. So this isn't something that is going to end after the public comment period. It's going to, we'll do the circulations as much as possible that we feel. Charlo. Oh, was there one up here?
We have an online question as well.
Okay.
So we'll take the two in the room first and then the online.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to echo, just to put on the record, I don't need any additional follow-up, but I come from the industrial sector and we have about 50 different business groups that I work with, and the January 31st is going to be difficult for us. You know, we use a lot of consultants and there's only a limited number that are experts in some of the things that we need, and we're going to be resourcing those same. So I know CASQA has the comments, but from the regulated community, I'll just echo it just for the record.
Thank you.
And my follow-up question is this. On October 5th, the Los Angeles Regional Water Board convened an industrial permit working group, and the topic was non-filers. And the committee that they pulled together was industrial members, waterkeeper groups, at least one city was on there, LADWP was there, and some of the numbers that they threw out from the Regional Water Board was conservatively 25% non-filers, more realistically 50 to 60% are non-filers. And from the industrial sector, when we're working on our BMPs, our discharge issues, for every one of us, if there's another one that's not doing the same thing and essentially just discharging without any BMPs or anything, how does this process and how does the watersheds fit into it? I guess just, you know, from a basic point of view, it feels like we're doubling up on our efforts. But I know from the watershed point of view, and as a Californian who drinks that water, you know, I want to make sure it's clean as well. But I think we want to have some fairness across the board. So thank you.
So with the non-filers, those are, for the benefit of the audience, those are dischargers who would be required to file for this permit, but have not come forward and filed. And so they may be discharging industrial stormwater without a permit. And it creates, non-filers create an on-level playing field for the regulated community who is doing everything they can to comply. We cannot put requirements on people who don't get our permit. It is very difficult. It's a difficult situation in this permit. And we used to do, back in 2008, we had staff that would send out letters to all the suspected non-filers from different economic databases, and we stopped doing it because we got so many returns, and it's very difficult to actually identify non-filers. There's a lot of different estimates of how many are out there. So currently how we identify non-filers is through the regional water boards and the cities. They tell us who needs the permit or who they think needs the permit, and the regional water boards may actually do their enforcement, and they would take those referrals from the cities. So with the TMDLs, so we have this issue with people not getting the permit, but for the regulated community, one thing with these TMDL translations, is they're concentration based. So what your neighbor is doing, it may not matter for your compliance equation. It is just a concentration based limit that would apply to anybody under the permit. It isn't a mass base. You're not pulling from each other for how much you get to discharge. Everyone has the same allocation. And so that helps, at least for new people coming into the permit or out of the permit. It wouldn't change your number. But yes, the non-filer issue is always a concern. Yeah.
No, I would just say, continue to press. We found, and I was on the committee, so that's why I was able to speak to it. But we found continually beating the drum for the regional water boards, for the cities, and then also for us to realize it should be collaborative. The committee we had the environmental groups, industry, cities, LADWP, and I think kind of forcing everybody into the same room helps. I know there was at least one board member from the State Water Board there, but I think that, from whatever side that you come from, I think that, everybody would preach, get a permit, get on board, and I think you get support from everyone on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There was one.
I have two questions. One question was, you referred to the trash TMDL kind of vaguely, complying with the industrial general permit is complying with the trash TMDLs. Does that have something to do with the municipality trash TMDLs, where it's going to translate into the industrial general permit? Is that the idea?
We're translating the TMDLs as they're written, and so are you referring to the trash policy and what?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not in line with the trash policy requirements as of yet. We're not implementing the trash policy through our permit. We're implementing the TMDL requirements as they're written. And so the way that it's been translated for now is a BMP-based comply with the permit option. And so that's how we're moving forward with the proposed amendment language for the two trash TMDLs that we have to address.
And then the other question was, we have just for example, the Santa Ana River Basin, if they decide we're going to have a TMDL, does that automatically get incorporated? Because you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that you're required to include TMDLs from the basin plans, or would it go through another process like this?
Once regional boards adopt their TMDLs and is approved by USCPA, or if USCPA adopts TMDLs for our regions, they're not going to be automatically incorporated. Of course, we would have to develop language for that, but we would group the TMDLs that are adopted from here on forth after this amendment cycle is over, so that we have a new list of TMDLs that we know that we would have to incorporate into the permit in a future reissuance or amendment of the permit.
So it would go through a similar process?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to chime in a little bit on the trash policy versus the two TMDLs that we're incorporating through this amendment for industrial stormwater. There were only two TMDLs statewide that specifically listed industry as a source of a trash TMDL. We will be implementing the full trash policy through the reissuance of the permit in 2020. So it will be implemented, just not through this amendment.
So the question from online is from Joe King, and it is, please provide guidance on how the 24-hour drawdown for the compliance option would be calculated and or enforced. For example, if a facility plans to reuse and collect stormwater on site, how would they demonstrate they can use all of the water within 24 hours? Would calculating the average water use at the facility and showing that the water would be reused within 24 hours on average be sufficient? Or would they have to determine the minimum water use used in one day for the size of the BMP that's based on?
So I'm not going to answer in particular. That's a very specific question, but just know that there's fact sheet language that describes the model that we used to come up with the 85th percentile 24-hour storm event. The assumption, as we were looking at that model that was developed on behalf of a consulting company, they developed it for us as a volunteer effort. There's a 85th percentile 24-hour storm event, a certain volume tied to that, and the intent of this language is to not discharge that volume of water. And you have 24 hours to make sure the BMP has enough volume, capacity to take the next volume of stormwater. There are some concerns and some things that we're going to be working through the amendment before it gets adopted on how to define that, but our intent was that you would have enough capacity for every 24-hour period of that volume of water, and it's a lot of water. And so I think we'll respond to Joe King offline. If you guys have similar questions or concerns, I would put those through the public comment, the actual official record, because we're trying to figure out where the confusion is. And we've gotten a few comments similar to Joe's, so I'm not gonna, it's a very detailed question that I would prefer to answer to Joe specifically.
Are there?
So I realize we're being mean when we're ping-ponging her across the room here. One other question that I had is, as you well know, the Phase 2 general permit is also going through a very similar process right now of incorporating the TMDLs. And one of the things that we're, kind of talking through right now with State Board staff and others is the possibility about when the actual effective date occurs, which is something I think, Laurel, that you mentioned. Right now, are you all considering any sort of time frame in which the effective date would actually apply, whether it would be 6 months after adoption or a year? And the reason why I ask that is because the Phase 2 MS4s are in the same boat, where these TMDLs are being incorporated for the very first time, and where attainment dates have already passed, it puts them into almost immediate noncompliance, or in this case, immediate requirements to meet these numbers that before maybe didn't have to be met. And it seems rather unfair, frankly, to hit up a permittee who's never been subject to the requirements before, not really been given the time to come up to speed to try to meet them, and then have them kind of be out of compliance without the benefit of a TSO, which takes a significant amount of time. And so I was just wondering if this is at all a possibility that could be considered for this as well.
Hi, this is Diana Messina with State Board staff. Karen, that's a very important issue that our State Water Board members have been grappling. And at tomorrow's board meeting for the proposed consideration of adoption for the small MS4 permit, this is an issue that will be thoroughly discussed, and more options are being looked at how to establish a fair, effective date for dischargers that for the first time are having requirements, TMDL requirements implemented through their permit. Just to let everyone know, the issue here is that a TMDL requirement on a discharger is not implemented and enforceable until it is placed in a permit or a permitting action. So, so my response would be to really pay attention to tomorrow's board meeting on how our State Water Board is addressing that for small municipalities, and then kind of continue on, like Laurel was stating, on carving out how to address the same issue with the industrial stormwater dischargers.
So if I may maybe ask the question, given that a little bit differently, if some sort of effective date agreement was adopted tomorrow for Phase 2, would that same concept potentially be applied in this case? I mean, I know you can't predict the future. I'm just asking, would that be something you would consider given the similarities between the permits?
Yes, at the staff level, we would consider that. We do need your public input to demonstrate the concern and the situation that it does place industrial dischargers. And the answer is yes. We will go forward with thinking through how we can establish an effective date for the industrial dischargers that will work for them. We are not looking to place dischargers, to push dischargers in a corner to where they absolutely cannot comply. We want compliance. We want protection of water quality. And so once we see what gets carved out tomorrow for the municipal dischargers, that'll give us a little more idea of the direction that we may be allowed to go in for the industrial dischargers.
Another thing I wanted to add is we're trying to keep the scheduling in line with important deadlines that we have in the permit already. And so is the July 1st or is it July 30th? I always forget. Yeah. July 1. So the July 1st deadline in the permit is something that we want to keep in line with. So if we're going to be going through the leveling process for TNOWs as well, we want to make sure that we kind of hit that mark for responsible dischargers, for dischargers complying with the TMDL requirements. So say, for example, if the permit is adopted in August of this year, and if everyone deems the state as okay, we would have the requirements of the permit be effective on July 1st of the following year. So we're kind of looking at the July 1st mark line to make sure that it's a good date to start with. Have any other questions? If not, it's a good time to break for lunch and potentially come back and see if you've generated more comments.
Here, I'm going to do a raise of hands. Who plans to come back after lunch? I mean, you guys want to come back after lunch? There might be questions that come up. Raise hands who wants to come back after lunch. Okay, so if
no questions?
I'm just asking, if you guys,
Yeah.
if this is it, Serena, do you have any, can we break early? Okay. So,
if you have any follow-up questions, you can definitely contact me. We have, and I have business cards up front too, as well as Laurel. But how do I? Oh,
yeah. So if you want to hang out, we're going to hang out for a little bit. If you guys want to come up and ask us questions, but I think that we've heard the comments. So thank you for your time, and
sure,
absolutely.
Hi, I realized I failed to introduce myself before. I'm Serena Liu from the Office of Chief Counsel, and I just wanted to emphasize for everyone, we really appreciated hearing your questions and your feedback today, but if you have a comment, it needs to be made verbally or in writing at the hearing or in your written comment letters. So just raising it here today, please make sure you do the follow-up. Thank you.
Yeah, so what Serena's saying is if you say it here or if you give us an email over the web, it's not going to be in the official record unless it goes to the clerk or you do it in front of the board on January 9th. All right, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
you.